Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Kosick, and I'm the Knowledge Manager for the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. Welcome to today's session, Spotlight on Training, which will feature the Before Operational Stress program. Before we get started, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. So first, all attendees are in listen-only mode, and that's to limit feedback and noise. Today's session is being recorded. You will be sent a copy tomorrow, so if you miss anything, you can watch it again. The GoToWebinar launch window can be blocked by some organizations, so if you're having trouble hearing or seeing, you may have to join us by phone. Lastly, we will be looking for audience questions at the end of the session, so please send us your questions through the questions box or be ready to raise your hand to ask your question live. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Megan McElheran, a clinical psychologist with the Wayfound Group and chair of CIPSRT's clinical subcommittee. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over presenter to you, and hopefully I got your name right.
You did, Emily. You nailed it. Yay! After all that, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just sharing my screen here.
Oh, it went away from slideshow mode.
Oh, hold on. Okay, so I want to do that, and then hold on. I'm just gonna put up my slideshow. Can you just confirm, Emily, that you can see what I want you to see?
I'm just seeing the notes view, so if you just go and swap, and we'll be good. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So you can slides the way we want them?
We can. Just go ahead and hit the little orange arrow on your screen so we don't see your go-to panel. Sometimes it wants to show up, so.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Perfect.
Wow. Okay, so we're all good now?
We're all good.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's talk on the Before Operational Stress program. The timing of this could not be better. I'm just thrilled. While I can't go into tremendous detail, I can say that we found out this week that through all of our partnerships with Wayfound and the Before Operational Stress program with the University of Regina, we're going to have some large-scale opportunity to disseminate BOS across the country and the territories with some pretty significant funding. So you will note at the end of my presentation today that we actually have a QR code. And so if you are interested in learning more about BOS, potentially, maybe signing yourself or some of your service up, you can just take a picture of that QR code. It'll lead you to a spot where you can essentially provide whatever information you're comfortable with sharing, and then we can potentially be in touch with you to keep you abreast of what's coming. So please do stay tuned because we've got some really, really exciting formal announcements yet to come. So I guess a little bit of background about me and it's relevant to the program itself. I'll just probably go to this next slide. Oh, hold on. Pardon me, everyone. I'm always so useless when it comes to the tech parts of this. Emily, I'm going to trust that you're all seeing that I moved my slides, so you'll let me know if not,
yeah,
okay?
It's all good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So Wayfound Mental Health Group, as some of you may know, maybe not, used to be known as WGM Psychology, and WGM Psychology, those are actually my father's initials. He started our practice here in Calgary back in 1999. And I started working in the field of military and public safety mental health in 2003, 2004, in the US, in the United States Veteran Affairs System through my graduate training. And I was actually at the time very interested simply in trauma and how people recovered from traumatic events, and going to school and wanting to gain training in that area just sort of naturally brought me into working with uniformed service personnel. And so I returned home to Calgary in 2007, sort of took over the practice from my father, and really, our practice here in Calgary and Edmonton and Red Deer and Toronto has kind of grown from there. And our primary group that we work with is public safety personnel. So, when I came back to Canada, I worked in the operational stress injury clinic here in Calgary. So, was working primarily with military members and RCMP officers, veterans. And when I transitioned into full-time community-based practice in 2011, started actually working more so with municipal police and firefighters and paramedics and border services and corrections and other sort of folks who we now know fall under the public safety sort of umbrella. And this is relevant to the development of the BOS program in so much as from 2011 to 2015, let's say, when it started to become understood that, there was a practice in Calgary, because we hadn't expanded at that point in time, maybe where there was a little bit of cultural competency about the work of public safety, myself and then ultimately colleagues who started to join me in the practice, we just became, it was like the dam broke open and we were just running to try to keep up with, trying to help all of the people who were coming forward and reaching out for help and supports. And that was particularly influenced by the implementation of presumptive legislation that came along in Alberta in 2012 and at different places in the country at different points in time. But as you may know, as I'm sure you do, presumptive legislation really made it easier for public safety personnel to receive the mental health care that they needed. But so as that dam sort of opened up, and thankfully I was very happy that we were able to support the people that we were. One of the things that started to occur to me as we were just all again just trying to keep up with the workload and all of the people who were coming to us with really chronic and disabling symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health conditions, I stopped at one point in time and I was just like, what? This can't be the only thing we're doing. Like, we can't simply be just reacting to these really severe psychological injuries people are sustaining. And was noticing that the people who were coming to see me really were, like, they'd been holding on for as long as they possibly could, but ultimately, like, they weren't sleeping. They probably, had developed some comorbid substance abuse problems. Their marriages were either falling apart or had fallen apart. Oftentimes they were unable to work. And so they were coming for care really at the point in time where the chronicity and just the severity of psychological injury they had sustained really meant some things in terms of their prognosis and the outcome for how they were likely going to recover, which frankly meant, we were going to try to help as best as we possibly could them resume a state of, improved functioning. But it wasn't sort of this understanding that we were probably going to get back to like baseline or pre-morbid functioning from where they were when they started their careers, let's say. So I got thinking that, like, this is just probably not a way to go about this work that felt really satisfactory or frankly even maybe ethical from my perspective. So wasn't there more that we could do to try to actually get more upfront with, helping people in the context of their work versus just solely being in this kind of reactive state of mind or reactive position? One of the other things that I was noticing is that in the work that we were offering in clinical practice, for myself personally, if I was seeing 6, 7, sometimes 8 people a day, I was probably having a very similar conversation on some particular topics 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day, right? Talking about, okay, this injury you've sustained is not a sign that you are a weak person or that you have failed in the deployment of your duties in whatever sector you're working in. There's something about the context that is impacting your mental health and this injury you've sustained, right? So conversations that were very consistent and that every single person I was seeing needed to hear, right? They needed to understand what was happening to their nervous system. They needed to understand some things about dysregulation and how to work to improve regulation of their nervous system, so on and so forth. And that really led to, again, thinking, why are we only providing this information and these, this education at a time when people are already injured and in this kind of chronic and severe state of impairment? Why aren't we trying to do more by saying, arguably, if one of the things we need to teach people to do as part of their healing is to learn more about regulating their nervous system, well, why aren't we teaching them about regulation of their nervous system before they even start their job, right? And so these are some of the really key clinical things that were happening sort of foundationally as part of developing the before operational stress program. I'm really bad at keeping up with my slides. So this is just a slide that shows, really since we've been working in the community, starting in Calgary for myself in 2011 was when I went into full-time community practice, up to today, we're seeing something in the realm of 15, that number's probably actually increased during the pandemic, 15 to 20,000 public safety clients per year. And I think why that's important to what we're going to talk about with BOS today is that, again, from the development perspective, my intention was really to try to build a program based on the feedback and the lived experience I was hearing from the people that I was trying to help. And, you know, just going back to what I just said a moment ago about like, why aren't we teaching these things to people before they're injured? That was a very common sentiment that I was hearing from many people that I was working with in treatment was, I wish I'd known this when I started my career. Maybe I could have done some things differently to try to protect myself, right? I'm just gonna, here we go. I'm just gonna move us to here. So in 2016, so some of this kind of foundational reflecting and thinking about you know, the problem we were facing started to happen in and around, you know, 2014, 15, you know, life being this serendipitous kind of thing that it is. In 2016, I had the opportunity to be introduced to Wounded Warriors Canada, who, as many of you I'm sure know, you know, is a charitable organization, and its mandate originally was to work with providing mental health intervention to military members, veterans, and their families. But they have recently, well, in the last 6 years, broadened their scope to cover all of uniformed service personnel. I had the opportunity to meet them, and particularly to be introduced to the Couples Overcoming PTSD Everyday program, the COPE program, which is a 5.5-day residential program that Wounded Warriors Canada has been offering since 2016. It's a group-based program for couples where one member of the couple has developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And actually had the opportunity to go out and facilitate the second COPE program that was running in BC. And one of the things that this did, in addition to sort of the introduction to Wounded Warriors Canada, was it also gave the opportunity to really kind of connect again with the power of group interventions when we're talking about decreasing stigma and helping people to learn in a cohesive kind of a way. In the COPE program and in subsequent group programs that I facilitated, and certainly in our BOS programs, that thing about being in a group with people who understand the work that you do, right? They're your peers, maybe not of the same sector, but like they understand what it means to be someone who puts a uniform on every day for work. Just coming into a room and hearing another person that has just sort of implicit trust in you because of the work that you do talk about anger and talk about you know, being impacted by the work and talk about the, you know, the struggles and the symptoms and all these things, that in and of itself is a powerful therapeutic intervention where you can see when you bring groups of people together and start having these conversations, there's almost this, you know, like everybody's shoulders kind of relax, and there's this sense of, oh, I actually really am not alone in what I've been experiencing or what I've been struggling with. So all those things came together, and so in 2016 and 17, just kind of off the side of my desk, I started actually putting together, okay, so we had at that point in time the Road to Mental Readiness program, and I have nothing but good things to say about Road to Mental Readiness. I think in terms of what it's done, particularly in the public safety sector, about starting conversations and you know, destigmatizing issues related to mental health, you know, there's just not enough credit that can be given for that outcome. And some of what I was hearing from folks was, I took R2MR and then I kind of left with a sense of, I'm not totally sure what to do next in terms of how I translate this knowledge into my day-to-day life, right? There was sometimes some feedback around, depending on who or how R2MR was taught, people felt like they took greater or lesser things away from it. So I really heard that and thought, okay, so to my way of thinking, R2MR and the Before Operational Stress program actually work really quite beautifully together, in that R2MR kind of gets the conversations going, and then really what we wanted to try to accomplish with BOS was then be able to add in the sort of now what experience. So in 2017, and ultimately by the end of 2017, the Before Operational Stress program in its original form was created, which was to say we were going to offer, we had put together an 8-week, 2 hours per session group therapy intervention that would run with up to 10 participants, public safety participants in a group. There would be 2 clinical facilitators. And so for 8 weeks, every week at the same time for 2 hours, we would get together as a group and we would go through the curriculum, which I'm going to walk you through here in just a second, giving people the opportunity to learn the information prevention. So there's some of that information and education that ultimately becomes part of treatment, but attempt to teach people about these concepts and these ideas within the structure of this group of supportive peers, where you're actually creating peer support, and you are really using the therapeutic mechanisms or factors a group can bring as part of helping people to, enhance their mental health, potentially improve some of their health promotion activities, maybe lessen the impact of some of the operational and organizational stressors they were facing. And at the end of those 8 weeks, so 16 hours together, 2 hours at a time for 8 weeks, we would then have 10 months of follow-up, where that same cohort would come back together on a monthly basis and meet for 2 hours. And really the follow-up groups were intended to be very unstructured and just give people an opportunity to come back together, talk about what had happened in the course of the month, reiterate some of the concepts and ideas that we had talked about and learned, and then hopefully sort of shore up some of that resiliency, for lack of a better word, that they might have going back to do their jobs between our monthly sessions. So the end of 2017, I took that program to Wounded Warriors Canada and said, what do you think? And at the time, it was just, again, one of these serendipitous things. They were very interested in adding something to the suite of their programs that was an upstream kind of a program. And they committed a significant amount of initial funding to the program to support a sample of people to go through the program to see, how it was responded to and ultimately the data that could gather. At the same time, so Wounded Warriors Canada and Scott Maxwell and Phil Ralph came on board. We developed sort of what the program would look like, and we were going to clinically facilitate it within Wayfound. And Nick Carlton and I, the scientific director of CIPCERT, we've known each other for years, and I was it was very important to me that in just starting to disseminate the BOS program, with the charitable sponsorship from Wounded Warriors Canada, that we actually engage from the word go in independent evaluation of the program, because I think we all know there's lots and lots out there. And, my theory was that some of what we were going to sort of offer with BOS was going to have measurable and statistically significant impact on people's mental health, which is ultimately what we ended up finding. I didn't want to make that assumption. And so with, again, support, I sort of pitched this to Nick and showed him the program, and he said, yep, CIPCERT would be interested in conducting an independent evaluation, or researchers from CIPCERT, I should say. And so we went through a research ethics board process, and ultimately in October of 2018, with all of these sort of stakeholder groups working together, the BOS program in the original format that I've just described was launched. And so dissemination of the program and collection of data went on until actually really kind of came to a halt in when the pandemic started in March 2020, but we had enough data at that point in time, and ultimately we had our first publication of that original set of data that came out in August of 2021, and certainly happy to circulate that publication if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it. In the pilot sample, what we did find was in fact that there was statistically significant change for people who received the BOS intervention in terms of reducing symptoms of reported post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, enhancing quality of life, and some other metrics. And I actually have a slide on that in a second. So, as we all know, when the pandemic hit, we had to pivot and change how we did everything overnight. And so, up to March of 2020, there were lots of services and lots of groups of people who were very interested in accessing the BOS program. There started to be a little bit of kind of like word of mouth, and some of us took it, and it was helpful for us, and growing interest in the program. But it required us overnight to shift to figuring out how to deliver the program in a completely telehealth or virtual sort of system. So in March of 2020, in conjunction with the divisional officer of our program here in Wayfound. Her name is Dr. Mila Svastjevich. She's the clinical officer for the BOS program. We sort of put our heads together and said, okay, we need to be able to deliver this virtually because people are still wanting the program, but we obviously can't gather in groups of people. And so the second condition of BOS was born. And what we decided to do, frankly, based on the fact that there wasn't a tremendous research base to support how to do group processing through telehealth, and it wasn't something that we felt that we had enough sort of competency in, we decided to take the BOS education and have that be what was delivered or disseminated to groups of peers still getting together. So we would have one of our clinicians delivering the program to 10 to 15 public safety members, however they might be able to congregate. Sometimes they were able to get together in like a big auditorium and maintain social distance. Sometimes they had to be distant. But what we found was that shifting to that sort of delivery mechanism did allow for that cohort, that peer support to still form. So it was different, obviously, than what we had originally established with the sort of in-person program, but it gave us another option to be able to continue to support people using virtual health. So one of the things, happy accidents and serendipity all over the place. One of the things that I certainly didn't anticipate, but it actually has come to be very clear, is that in terms of the sort of curriculum and what we're offering in BOS, one of the things we came to understand is that our original data, like the sample that we gathered our original data from, they were a group of people who were really struggling with psychological health disruption. And so it made sense that if you give them, sort of group therapy interventions and really good sort of cognitive behavioral interventions, that they would reasonably show some improvements in their mental health. Again, the spirit and the hope of BOS is to actually position this really as something that is a preventative healthcare measure. I want to be very, very clear. We're not saying that you take BOS, we're going to prevent operational stress injuries, not at all. What we're trying to do is look at providing the curriculum and the experience of BOS early in career to potentially mitigate the impacts of operational stress and give people more efficacy and empowerment and agency in terms of how they're taking care of their mental health. So as you see in this slide before us, what we have really done on the heels of the original data sample that we saw the statistically significant effects in, what we've learned in COVID, what really the spirit and the hope of the BOS program is, right, as I said, which is to be this kind of potential mitigator of the impacts of operational stress, is to create what we call a continuum of care. So we've created a digital format of the program. So myself, Dr. Mila, Dr. Andrew Carlquist, who is a just seasoned psychologist who's working out in Toronto and an incredible advocate for BOS and a very passionate BOS facilitator. The three of us came together and basically, videoed the program and have created a module-based digital sort of online version of the program that participants are able to access in a go-at-your-own-pace kind of way. So they're getting the same education, they're getting some engagement types of exercises, but it's not requiring people to congregate in groups. It's a go-at-your-own pace, so it's therefore a little bit more accessible, and it's broadly available to people versus the administrative or practical requirements of people, having to come together at a certain time to receive the education. We've also been asked in the last year by a couple of police services and fire services, and we're starting to see more information or more interest in this, actually creating a lecture series, taking the BOS content and teaching it to new recruits. So we've now done, I think, 3 or 4 of these lecture series to new entries or recruits into careers, again, different sectors of public safety. BOS Peer is what we're calling the virtual, so clinician delivering to a group of peers. And then the BOS Intensive is that original, sort of group therapy, sitting down together, more intensive group process kind of a focus, okay? And, we've attempted to do this just because, again, across the country in the last 4 years that we've been disseminating the program, we've just been hearing from different services, whether it's fiscal realities, in terms of how much sort of mental health training budget people have available, whether it is, the makeup of the public safety organization, and maybe there aren't people who are requiring the more intensive offering that the in-person program requires. We felt it was useful useful and therefore have put quite significant effort over the last couple of years into developing this continuum of care. And so with the exciting news that we received this week and the opportunity we're going to have to disseminate BOS over the next 8 to 9 months, we are going to be looking at broad offerings to people of the online or the digital format of the BOS program. Broad dissemination of the peer, so the telehealth delivery, and then a smaller but still significant number of BOS programs to folks who can come and attend the program in person with clinical facilitators. So again, if you're interested in learning more about this, as I said, the QR code will be coming up, but I want you to understand that's kind of been the development or how the program has evolved over time, is really from, this in-person, let's see how this works kind of thing, to what we learned through our research, to then what we've attempted to do by way of responding to what we've heard from the agencies and the groups that we've worked with, and certainly COVID influenced that significantly as well. I have all this information to share if anyone's interested and wants this. Again, if you are interested in that, we can certainly send this. So I'm going to walk through, how much time do I have? Okay, good. I'm doing okay. I have a very bad habit of just going, off. This is kind of the structure or what we're talking about in the program itself. So whether a participant is accessing the BOS program in person, through the telehealth delivery, or in the digital version, or in the lecture series, these are the topics that we are touching on. And so when I think about, what seemed important in the development of the BOS program content, I very much think about what we do in BOS as really, a journey or a story that starts in a particular place, and then each module that we walk through builds on what came before, so that by the time we end up in the 8th module, we're really bringing together some threads of what we've been talking about really from the moment that we got together. So I will mention that in the intensive or the in-person program, we do a clinical intake on the front end of that, because we do want to understand who's coming into the groups, and if we think that the person's going to be a good candidate for what the in-person program has to offer. And in cases where maybe somebody's been really symptomatic and they need some stabilization, we support that person to get connected with other resources. So we do an intake just to make sure that people who are coming into the in-person groups are going to be able to maximally benefit from what the groups have to offer. But we do want to make sure that that you understand that if someone's not sort of determined to be an ideal candidate, part of our job at intake and throughout is to help people get connected with resources and with services that will be helpful to them. And I'll just say, actually, something that's been kind of interesting is across the people who have received BOS thus far, and so since 2018, I should know this number off the top of my head, we're close to 1,000 people who have received BOS in that period of time. We've generally seen somewhere 30 to 40% of people have wanted to carry on with ongoing psychotherapy, typically, whether that's been sort of, I just need someone to kind of check in with now that I have some different understanding, or people have gone, I actually think I need more than what I've been getting. So that's actually one of the things we hypothesized, is that we would see an increase in help-seeking behavior, and we see that as actually a very good thing in terms of people taking some proactive steps to take care of their mental health. So I just sort of offer that as a note. So in the first session, I kind of say, when we start our groups, the first couple of sessions are probably the hardest, because we are really, looking at, in a way, kind of the problem that we're facing, right? So we talk about in Module 1, we know if we look at Dr. Carlton's work in 2018 that, in the study that he published with a group of researchers, that 44.5% of PSP in the sample that were surveyed in that particular study 44.5 were screening positively for at least one mental health condition, right? Like that's kind of a staggering, startling number to think about, that, you know, when you bring a group of PSP together, you know, potentially we're thinking that one out of two of those people is struggling with a clinically significant mental health condition, right? What we try to do in module 1 is just go, okay, why do we think that is? Like what's happening in public safety culture and public safety work that is contributing to this really high impact on mental health and mental health deterioration. And so we talk about, you know, things that would be common to R2MR, things that we know that people working in public sectors need to understand, things like moral injuries and compassion fatigue. But we talk significantly about culture, and we, you know, propose or hypothesize that there's been something about the culture of public safety that has really encouraged people to suppress and disengage and sort of deny or minimize the emotional impacts the work has had on them. And one of the things we talk about is the idea of stoicism, and how you know, historically in sort of modern civilization, you know, going back, you know, hundreds of years, there's been this sort of notion that to be effective and competent as a police officer, a firefighter, a soldier, you have to be stoic, and you have to be able to demonstrate that, like, you're good to go and nothing kind of gets to you, and you're highly disciplined and you're impervious to sort of being rattled, right? And our submission is that that has actually been a significant part of the problem, that actually that's potentially interfering with people being able to allow a natural process of emotional and psychological digestion to happen in the face of critical incidents and operational stress. And we actually talk a bit about Stoic philosophy and how the Stoic philosophers influenced public safety culture, and actually sort of look at some of the myths that we seem to have developed about what Stoicism actually means, to open up some space to say, you know, the natural thing to feel when confronted, you know, with something horrifying is to feel horrified, right? Not to go, well, that is horrifying, but I'm cool, right? Because what we see and what we understand is that that denial of experience and that sense of, if I show myself to be struggling, I'm going to be criticized, potentially rejected, seen as less than. So there's some real high social stakes to people being able to demonstrate that they're good to go. So that's what we spend a lot of time talking about in module 1, and we introduce an idea called functional disconnection and functional reconnection as an alternative to this sort of stiff upper lip stoicism that seems to have been kind of the cultural norm for many, many, many years. That leads us into what we talk about then in modules 2 and 3, where we actually just, you know, so we spend significant time in the second module talking about, well, what's happening in the brain and nervous system when the stress response is continually activated and potentially activated and remained activated over, you know, chronic periods of time. So what are the downstream effects of that? And we talk about trauma in the brain, and actually what are some of the changes that, you know, research tells us potentially happen for folks when they are struggling with an operational stress injury like post-traumatic stress disorder, and actually being able to sort of help people to understand that there are actual, like, biological, physiological changes that are happening. It kind of decouples or depersonalizes and starts to open up more space for our participants to consider, well, maybe this isn't actually me, like maybe I'm not failing, maybe this is something to do with you know, this work in this context and this culture that I'm working in. And I'll say in our BOS groups, and certainly in our COPE programs and other times when I've taught this material, the relief you see come across people's face when they start to understand that there are, you know, legitimate sort of biological things that can start to change in the face of chronic exposure to stress and trauma, right? Again, it allows for this opportunity to go, oh, like maybe this is actually an injury. Maybe this isn't about me failing or not being good enough or being deficient in some kind of a way. And that starts to open up some opportunities for people to really reflect and think differently about themselves in the context of their work. And so that leads us into talking about, you know, what are we thinking when we're talking about, you know, nervous system regulation and how we actually start to help people relate differently to what they're having to encounter on a day-to-day basis. And we talk significantly about the window of tolerance in the third module. I would say that our experience is that this module on the window of tolerance seems to be the one that people just grab onto and really take away, because what we do, we talk about Dan Siegel's work and the window of tolerance and some of the conceptualization about post-traumatic stress disorder specifically not being what we thought it was 15 or 20 years ago, which is a disorder related to fear and needing to do fear extinction, but actually, significantly about ways in which the nervous system response becomes dysregulated because in many respects that stress response is being activated and chronically activated in a way that taxes that system, because that's not what it was designed to do. And we talk about Robert Sapolsky's work. That's another aside that I won't go into, but we end up leaving session 3 actually using the window of tolerance as a self-monitoring tool. So we give people an opportunity to take away the education and the material that they've now learned, and we give them an actual practical sort of day-to-day, almost like hour-to-hour intervention that they can start to use to really pay attention to where they're at from a nervous system perspective, how regulated or dysregulated they may feel. And we talk about, if you find that you're feeling hyper aroused, fight and flight, anxious, here's some things you can do to help yourself. That may not be the things that you want to do if you're actually more so in a hypo aroused state where you're sort of shut down and just overwhelmed by stress, right? So we actually talk about, here's some nuanced ways to try to take care of yourself, because it's not just about going to do some breathing exercises. Like, we actually can have more sophistication in terms of how we try to respond to this dysregulation should it occur. What that then does, so we've kind of established the culture, we've looked at some hypotheses about what we think has been maybe contributing to these high rates of psychological injury. We've named some terms, we've given people an opportunity to sort of share their perspectives to the extent that they're comfortable doing so. We've then brought that into talking about, okay, like the biology and the brain, and here's what we understand, research and science tells us is happening. Here's a particular framework in terms of this nervous system dysregulation and a way to actually start, intervening in a more practical, concrete kind of a way. And then that gives us this opportunity to go, okay, so let's look at some really core cognitive behavioral therapy tools, right? And so in sessions 4, 5, and 6, that's what we do. We spend all of module 4 talking about the cognitive impacts of operational stress and how thinking can change when we're, sort of chronically overwhelmed and chronically experiencing high degrees of stress, whether that's organizational or operational. We talk about emotions and really, try to explore emotions as being, sort of data about our lived experience versus things that are a sign of our character or who we are as people, right? And we really try to, sort of reclaim and reconceptualize what emotions are actually all about, that there is no good or bad emotion, so long as we can learn how to relate to what our emotions are in a way that just allows them to be a source of information. And then we specifically talk in the behavior change module about avoidance and how, oftentimes when people are struggling, with post-trauma reactions or with high degrees of operational and organizational stress exposure, it's common to sort of withdraw and isolate and use avoidance as a coping strategy. But unfortunately, what we talk about is how that doesn't really work in the long term. And so we introduce, again, strategies and ideas that people can utilize across modules 4, 5, and 6 in a day-to-day, strategic intervention kind of a way to enhance their understanding of what's happening on the inside with their thoughts and their emotions and how that translates into behavior, to potentially give them some new perspectives on how they might cope and take care of themselves. And I will note that in modules 1 to 6, we really are focused on the individual, and we are trying to talk to people at that level, because we're looking at, I wish we could stop trauma from happening, but that's not particularly reasonable, as evidenced by what the last few years has offered us. So what we are really trying to look at is, how do we help people empower themselves? How do we help them find their efficacy and their agency to potentially meet those stressors from a different perspective within themselves? And if we don't have a means of understanding, what am I telling myself, and how is what I'm telling myself impacting how I'm feeling in this moment, and how may that be influencing my behavior, right? If we don't have any working understanding of that, we're probably going to be somewhat at a disadvantage of being able to be effective in managing or coping with the trauma and stressors that we experience. So 1 to 6 is very much a focus on these personal factors related to resiliency. We do talk about and use the term resiliency in BOS. Resiliency I find to be a challenging construct or idea because in my opinion, I don't think we have a really good operationalized definition of what resiliency actually means. What I've seen is that resiliency, if you ask someone about resiliency, the answer you're going to get is inherently related to their subjective experience of how well they feel they can or cannot cope with what life is offering them. And so we're trying to enhance people's sense of, I'm better able to handle what the world is offering me because I have greater connection, understanding of what's actually happening within myself. And I have some things I can do when I start to notice that I'm feeling, dysregulated, etc. When we start to get into modules 7 and 8, I like to think about this as we're now crossing the interpersonal bridge. So we've spent all this time really working on how do you take care of yourself differently. And now we're really trying to spend the final couple of sessions putting this into the social and interpersonal context. And we know, we have reams of research that tells us that we do better in terms of our mental health and recovering from any number of illnesses, mental health conditions, when we have strong social support. And so we want to talk about how do we use what we've been talking about in modules 1 to 6 to now maybe enhance our efficacy or enhance how we're relating and communicating to other people. So obviously in module 7, we spent the whole module talking about communication. We talk about communication styles. We give people specific communication exercises to practice, ones that we work on practicing. So it's pretty, they're foundational or fundamental communication skills, like how do you paraphrase? How do you check on perception? How do you make sure that you're with somebody in the context of the conversation? We talk about a model of diffusing conflict and give people some ideas on that. So I hope what you're hearing is that we're trying to give people, education and information, but we are also trying to marry that with, here's some of the ideas you can take away and things you can do to practice. And all of that brings us to the sort of the denouement, or the final part of the journey in module 8, which is, okay, so we've been talking about all of this stuff that is relevant and impactful for you in terms of your job and what happens inside of you when you're faced with these stressors. Now, what do we do about it? Like, what's the final kind of takeaway? And we spend time in module 8 talking about this model of functional disconnection and functional reconnection. And if you're interested in some light reading, Dr. Andre Stelnicki and I published a paper on this model in 2020. So again, I'm happy to share that publication if you'd be interested. Essentially, and we don't have time to go into tremendous detail today, but the functional disconnection and reconnection model is based off some work that a psychologist started in British Columbia a number of years ago. His name is Dr. Paul Whitehead, and he was doing some work with emergency room physicians and folks working in healthcare where they were having to, provide critical information to patients and families, and in his work found that these physicians talked about the need to have a functional disconnect, and that was part of what helped them to do their jobs. So we really took that idea and tried to embed it in contemporary public safety and talk about having more deliberate intention around the skills and the ways in which people need to operate when they're at work, which 100% is having to have that kind of stoic facade at the scene of a critical incident, but having more of a focus on what does the reconnection process look like? How do people actually allow for a process of, metabolizing to occur, and how are they actually doing that? What are some strategies and some ideas they can utilize to better bridge the gap between what is asked of them at work and then how they're taking care of themselves after the critical incident is done, or when they're making that transition between work and home. So this is the structure. So whether, it's the online or the lecture series or the virtual or the in-person condition, this is the material that's being presented. Now in the intensive or the in-person condition, we would then have a series of follow-up where the same cohort would get together to essentially help with knowledge translation and integration. We will continue to evaluate and see, how or if or in what ways we're going to do sort of booster sessions for participants after they've received one of the other conditions. But that's part of what we're hoping to learn more about and make some adaptations to over the course of the next year. Something else I wanted to say and I don't remember. So I've already sort of mentioned this. These are Wounded Warriors Canada continues to be heavily involved in the program, and as is CIPSRT. CIPSRT continues to manage the independent evaluation of the program. We will have a publication coming out on the virtual data that we've collected. I don't know when. Everybody is just so stretched thin, busyness wise, but that is on the docket, and we anticipate with this broad funding we've received and the dissemination that's going to occur over the next year, we'll have many more reports coming out on BOS and on the conditions and what we're learning. And so this is just a takeaway from the research I've already mentioned, right, that our original data set, the pilot data set, this is what our findings showed. You know, it was a small sample. You know, by no means are we saying 100% this is what BOS is doing, right? We need more research, as research always does, but we were quite pleased with these initial results, right, that we did see some statistically significant change in terms of, you know, people feeling better and also reporting fewer symptoms. Okay, so right, these are just some of the things that are, you know, potentially unique at this point in time. That, you know, peer support certainly isn't unique, but we really have found that that ability to set some terms of engagement, which is something that we do at the beginning of all of our programs, where we talk about the importance of preserving the sanctity of the groups themselves, is a key part of what seems to help people with their mental health. And so these are comments that Wounded Warriors Canada has received, which certainly mirrors, you know, some of the anecdotal feedback we've received as well, right? You know, that, you know, people felt like, you know, in addition to R2MR and potentially other programs, that there was, you know, some benefit that they saw in their own personal lives in terms of what BOS had to offer. So I'm going to put up this slide. So we have a couple of programs, but significantly the big project that we just learned about this week, and please do stay tuned, because we will have, I know, some formal announcements about this soon. We're just in the process of getting all of the practical administrative pieces completed. So if you are interested in perhaps learning more and seeing if you or your service can participate in what's coming up, again, you can just take a picture of this QR code and feel free to let us know how to get in touch with you. And then there's just our phone number and our website. And you're also welcome to take a picture here. This is my email here. I just want to give a shout out to Dan Sundal. The art that you're seeing in this slide set is from Dan's, and we do have permission from him to be using his art, which is, I think, pretty impactful and profound for lots of people. So, let me stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, I don't know, Megan, if you wanted to leave that QR code up just for people so they can have a little bit more time to scan it.
Totally happy to, Emily. Can you manage any questions to me then?
I can, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so again, we are to our question period here, so please feel free to submit questions through the questions box. I'm actually going to start with one that I kind of thought of as I was listening to you. With all these new, this continuum of options for BOS, do you envision developing some sort of matrix where you can decide maybe what might be a better fit for someone based on their screening?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have some of that already in the works. And so we, as I said, we have some materials that could be shared to try to help you figure out, like, you know, of the conditions that we have, what would be maybe ideal for, you know, a subset of your group, et cetera. So for sure, it's just a little bit more in depth than what I wanted to show on the presentation, but if people have interest in, again, we do have this sort of continuum of care document, and we have some additional materials that help you to sort of look at, this is what's offered, and this is how you maybe decide if it's a fit for you or not.
Okay, perfect. So as I mentioned, you guys can go ahead and start submitting questions through the questions box, or if you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to unmute you as well. The next question that I have here is, when you do research with BOS, when you research with BOS, found disease decreases in stigma, what was examined? So how was stigma defined and explored in your research context? So when you saw that decrease in stigma, how did you
Yes, so that came particularly through the assessment, so the quantitative measures, and it was there's a stigma measure that we use to assess stigmas particularly. I just have to drum it up and actually get the right name, because I always trip over them because they're always in acronyms. But so in our quantitative data set, we had a specific set of questions that asked about stigma. And then we got some feedback about 3 or 4 months into data collection saying, I don't feel like the questions you're asking me are accurately capturing what's happening for me in BOS. So the research team essentially did a rejig of the methods, and we added in a couple of qualitative questions, and that was also one of the sources of information on the reduced stigma. Now, we didn't, the qualitative piece, we didn't actually sort of use grounded analysis or anything like that to include in the research paper. So to some extent that was, actually, no, sorry, we did end up doing some qualitative analysis that fit into the final data set. So essentially we had 2 pieces. We had the quantitative and the qualitative that brought us to that place.
And I just want to let everybody know that the research papers that Dr. McElheran has talked about during this presentation, we do have access to both publications through the CIPSRT website. We also have a summary for both. So if you go to CIPSRT website and under research, search under publications, you can just search for Dr. McElheran's name. Same thing on the research summary side, just search her name in the top box and it'll bring up those 2 papers for you that she had mentioned. So easy access there and open access for everybody. Okay, so anybody else have any questions? I can see, I'm just waiting to see if there's any more hands that are, take this opportunity to ask more questions. I know that you've been actually quite thorough today sharing the program with us, so there might be less questions.
Well, when you think about something like in and out, day and out for, 8 years,
Yeah.
So I probably overwhelmed you with information. My apologies if that's the case.
I do have actually a quick question as well, and I was just thinking about this. Is this something that you want to offer strictly through organizations, or is it something that an individual could approach you to take?
Yeah, so either or. So what we have found, we actually, when we opened the program initially, it was very much on an individual basis, and so we would get enough sort of individual interest, and then we'd have enough of a group, and away we'd go. As the program has become more and more known, services as a whole have contracted for the program, so we actually are open to both. It's when we have sort of individuals, that's kind of just our process essentially, is we need to make sure that we have enough individuals to form a group, and then we can go from there. Obviously the online version of the program, that's available now. It's there's a link to it on our website if people are interested, and that's just you're going to get all the content that I described today. You're just not going to have the peer support aspect, obviously, but you're going to spend some time with myself and Neela and Andrew and basically walk through the program that way. But otherwise, if there was just individuals who were interested, they could just contact us, and we would get them on a list, and then once we had enough folks in the right sort of geographical area, we'd bring them together.
Okay, I do have another question that's come in that asks, can a private practice mental health clinician purchase the program?
So not necessarily purchase. What we have done, thank you for that question, because that actually reminds me. So in 2019, I think it was, yeah, it was 2019, there was quite a bit of interest in the program in Saskatchewan, and there was a donor who put forth a significant amount of money to support people who had been impacted by the Humboldt bus crash to receive BOS, and we're obviously not based in Saskatchewan. So we actually developed a training program in 2019, and to date, we've trained something like 90 clinicians across the country to deliver BOS, and we do have a set of fidelity measures that we've developed to make sure that wherever BOS is being delivered, it's consistent with how BOS is supposed to be delivered. Which has been an important aspect of the research. So while it's not sort of purchasing the program, what we essentially develop is a kind of a contractual relationship where we give you the ability to deliver the program wherever you happen to be based, and there's a fee structure that we've established that essentially we don't ever want to compromise the clinical sort of excellence and clinical skill delivery. So we found from what we've heard from folks the contract is quite competitive and has been quite welcomed by clinicians. So with this new project that we've just learned about, I suspect we're going to be doing some more training of clinicians. And so again, if you're a clinician in private practice interested in bringing this to your area, please send us a note, because we're super happy to explore that, very interested in continuing to build that clinical community.
So next question is, any thoughts on programming for support people? I assume they mean those that are in organizations but not frontline.
Yes, so assuming that's what's being meant, I hear that from potentially two perspectives. One perspective is, yeah, the maybe not exactly the frontline folks. I would argue that anybody in a public safety organization is being implicated by operational stress. And so while we potentially would customize some of the materials for people who are maybe not on the front line, I still think the material and the information is very important, both for individual mental health, but also understanding the organizational context as a whole. We've also developed, we're working with a group out of Queen's University on a program called Trauma-Informed Leadership that has also been supported by Wounded Warriors. And that actually really is looking at potentially the non-frontline staff and folks in leadership positions, helping them to essentially receive similar kind of education and information, but really embedding it in a leadership context, with the hope of having more inclusivity around some of the cultural changes that need to happen, right? Because everybody still working in public safety sectors is impacted by sort of the historical approaches to all of this stuff. So there's still work that needs to be done. I will also say I know there's lots of work going on in the areas of family and children. I'm actually working on a project with a group out of the University of Calgary who received funding through the Canadian Institute of Health Research to develop a PSP family program. And that program is going to start to be piloted here in the next probably month or so. Really specifically looking at spouses, but ultimately I think there's some plans of including children in that as well. So yeah, there's lots going on in this area, and really the support people of whatever ilk are crucial to some of the solutions to this problem.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The person that asked the question, if that's covered what you want to know, let me know. Otherwise, you can further. It did follow up with the people supporting PSP, so I do assume that includes families, and I did know about the BOS families that is happening out of UFC as well. So if you have any other questions about that, please let us know. So I'm just waiting here. I don't see any other questions that are coming in at the moment. So I'm going to give people a little bit of time just to send in some final questions, and I'm just going to. There we go. All right, so a few more seconds here, and if I don't see anything, then we can wrap it up for the day.
Okay.
All right, so it looks like I don't see anything else, so I will go ahead and wrap it up by thanking you for being here today and everyone in the audience for this great session. There is going to be a quick survey at the end of the town hall. We hope that you'll take a moment to complete it. CIPSRT does host these monthly town halls on topics specific to public safety personnel. If there's something you want to learn more about, just let us know in the survey. Next month's town hall is going to be titled Depression Crash Course. Dr. Vivian Lee will be joining us to talk about depression in a PSP context, including information about symptoms and treatments. It's actually based on a talk that Dr. McElheran gave for us last year about PTSD. So if you want to know more about PTSD, you can see that crash course on our website as well. And we hope that you'll join us for the one next month on depression. So a link for that will be included with the follow-up email that you receive tomorrow, which will also include a link to the recording of this session. Once again, I want to thank everyone for attending today. I want to encourage you to obviously stay safe and take care of yourselves.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.